Imagine ruling the most powerful empire on earth, an empire so vast that people proudly claimed, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." Now imagine being the woman who sat on that mighty throne, surrounded by servants, ministers, soldiers, magnificent palaces, priceless jewels, and unimaginable wealth, yet feeling completely alone. This is not simply the story of Queen Victoria. It is the story of a woman whose heart broke so deeply that she spent the next 40 years living in mourning. When people think of Queen Victoria, they often picture a stern old woman dressed entirely in black. But very few know why she chose that life, or what really happened behind the locked doors of Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Osborne House, and Balmoral. After the death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, the Queen's world changed forever. The palace continued to sparkle with royal ceremonies, but inside its walls, silence slowly replaced celebration. For decades, rooms remained untouched. Clothes were carefully preserved. Daily routines continued, as though one man had never truly left. It was a kind of grief unlike anything Britain had ever witnessed. But how did one tragedy change the life of the world's most powerful queen? And what really happened inside the palace after Prince Albert died? To answer those questions, we must travel back to December 1861. Queen Victoria had never imagined life without Albert, although there's been an arranged royal marriage. Genuine love quickly grew between them. Albert was far more than a prince. He became Victoria's closest friend, trusted advisor, political partner, and emotional anchor. Whenever she faced difficult decisions, Albert was there. Whenever she felt overwhelmed by the enormous responsibilities of ruling Britain, he calmed her fears. They had 9 children together, filling the royal household with laughter, noise, and constant activity. To Victoria, Albert wasn't simply her husband. He was the center of her universe. Then everything changed. In late 1861, Prince Albert became seriously ill. Doctors believed he was suffering from typhoid fever, though modern historians still debate the exact cause of his illness. For days, Victoria rarely left his bedside. She watched helplessly as the man she loved grew weaker. No amount of royal power could stop death from entering the palace. On the evening of December 14th, 1861, Prince Albert died at Windsor Castle. He was only 42 years old. Victoria was devastated. Witnesses later described scenes of unbearable grief. She cried uncontrollably. She refused to believe that Albert was truly gone. She repeatedly called his name, hoping for an answer that would never come. In that heartbreaking moment, Britain did not merely lose its prince consort. Queen Victoria lost the person she loved more than anyone else on earth. Yet what happened next shocked the entire nation. Most widows eventually returned to public life after a period of mourning. Victoria did not. Instead, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She dressed herself in black, not for weeks, not for months, but for the next 40 years. It was only the beginning. Behind the grand palace walls, strange routines quietly began. Prince Albert's bedroom remained exactly as he had left it. His clothes were carefully maintained. Fresh water for washing was brought to his room every single day. Servants continued preparing parts of his daily routine as though their master might return at any moment. To outsiders, it seemed impossible. To Queen Victoria, it was the only way she could survive the overwhelming pain. Britain still had a queen, but the woman who emerged after Albert's death was no longer the same Victoria who had once laughed beside her beloved husband. The empire continued to grow. The government continued to function. Royal ceremonies continued. Yet inside the palace, time seemed to stop. For Queen Victoria, December 14th, 1861, was not simply the day Prince Albert died. It was the day her own joyful life ended. And this was only the beginning of a 40-year journey through grief, loneliness, and the hidden world behind palace doors. In the next chapter, we will step inside those silent rooms and discover how Queen Victoria transformed the royal household into a living memorial to the husband she never stopped loving. When Prince Albert's funeral ended, the people of Britain believed that, with time, their queen would recover. They were wrong. Instead of slowly returning to normal life, Queen Victoria withdrew even further from the world. The laughter that had once echoed to the royal palaces disappeared, replaced by silence and routine. Ministers, servants, and even members of her own family noticed that something inside the Queen had changed forever. Every palace she lived in became a reminder of Albert. Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, and Balmoral Castle in Scotland no longer felt like royal homes. To Victoria, they had become museums of memory. Among all the rooms, one was treated differently from the rest. Prince Albert's bedroom. No one was allowed to change it. His bed remained neatly made. His books stayed on the shelves exactly where he had left them. His writing desk remained untouched, as though he had simply stepped outside for a walk. But the most extraordinary tradition was carried out every single morning. One of the royal servants entered Albert's room with fresh hot water for washing. His towels were replaced. His clothes were carefully brushed and laid out. Everything was prepared exactly as it had been during his lifetime. The routine continued day after day, year after year. To visitors, it seemed impossible to understand. Why prepare a room for someone who had been dead for years? But for Queen Victoria, Albert was still part of her daily life. She once wrote in her journal that she could not think of him as truly gone. In her heart, he remained her husband, and treating his room as if he still lived there gave her comfort in a world that suddenly felt empty. The palace staff quickly learned that Albert's room was more than a bedroom. It was sacred. Dust was removed with the greatest care. Nothing was moved without permission. Even the smallest object had to remain in its proper place. A misplaced book or a moved chair could upset the Queen for days. The servants rarely spoke about these duties outside the palace. Loyalty and discretion were expected from everyone who served the crown. Yet years later, accounts from members of the royal household revealed just how carefully these traditions had been preserved. The atmosphere inside the palace also changed. Grand banquets became less frequent. Music was heard less often. Lavish celebrations that had once filled the royal calendar quietly disappeared. Victoria no longer enjoyed the glittering social life that had once been expected of a monarch. Instead, she spent long hours reading Albert's letters. She revisited old diaries. She looked through family sketches and paintings. Sometimes she sat alone for hours, remembering happier days when Albert had walked beside her through the palace gardens. Her children worried about her. Some believed that their mother was allowing grief to consume her life. Others understood that Albert had been far more than a husband. He had helped guide the monarchy itself. Without him, Victoria often struggled to make decisions with the same confidence. Even members of Parliament became concerned. Britain's constitutional monarchy depended on the sovereign performing public duties. But Queen Victoria began canceling appearances. She avoided ceremonies. She rarely attended important social events. As the months turned into years, many ordinary people almost forgot what their queen looked like. Newspapers started asking difficult questions. Was the Queen abandoning her responsibilities? Should a monarch remain hidden while the empire continued to expand across the globe? Some newspapers criticized her openly, arguing that Britain needed a visible monarch, not a grieving widow hidden behind palace walls. Political cartoonists even mocked her absence. Public frustration slowly grew. Yet none of those critics could truly understand the depth of Victoria's pain. Every room reminded her of Albert. Every hallway carried memories of conversations they had shared. Every garden path recalled moments they had once walked together. Leaving those memories behind felt impossible. Instead, she clung to them. She wore black every day. She filled her surroundings with reminders of the man she had lost. To the outside world, this seemed unusual. To Victoria, it was love that had nowhere else to go. As the years passed, the Queen became known as the Widow of Windsor. It was a title she never officially chose, but one that reflected exactly how the nation saw her, a powerful ruler whose heart remained locked in the past. Still, one question remained unanswered. If Queen Victoria refused to return to public life, who would help her survive those lonely years? The answer would introduce one of the most controversial figures in royal history, a man whose close relationship with the grieving Queen sparked rumors that would follow her for the rest of her life. As the years passed, Queen Victoria became more isolated than ever before. She rarely appeared in public. Government ministers often had to travel to Windsor or Balmoral simply to meet her. Even members of her own family struggled to reach her emotionally. The woman who once stood proudly before cheering crowds now preferred long walks through quiet forests and lonely hills. It was during these difficult years that one man slowly became part of her daily life. His name was John Brown. Unlike politicians, noblemen, or royal advisors, John Brown came from a very different background. He was a tall, strong Scottish Highlander who had originally worked as a servant at Balmoral Castle, the Scottish estate that Queen Victoria and Prince Albert had loved more than any other royal residence. Albert himself had admired Brown's honesty, strength, and loyalty. After Albert's death, Victoria continued spending long periods at Balmoral because it reminded her of happier days. There, surrounded by Scotland's mountains, rivers, and forests, she found a small measure of peace. John Brown was often assigned to accompany the Queen during her carriage rides and long walks. Unlike many people at court, Brown did not treat Victoria as a distant monarch. He spoke to her naturally. He protected her, and when necessary, he was even willing to disagree with her. At first, some members of the royal household were surprised by behavior, but Victoria appreciated something that many others could not offer. She trusted him. For the first time since Albert's death, someone made the Queen feel safe rather than lonely. Brown became much more than a servant. He organized her daily outings. He ensured her security. He encouraged her to leave her rooms and spend time outdoors. Many historians believe his companionship helped Victoria recover enough to continue carrying out at least some of her royal duties. Yet not everyone welcomed his growing influence. Inside the palace, whispers began. Some courtiers believed Brown had become too close to the Queen. Others resented the fact that an ordinary Scottish servant could enter rooms and conversations that even aristocrats could not. Soon, the rumor spread beyond palace walls. Newspapers began publishing gossip. Political cartoonists joked about the Queen's favorite Highland servant. Some even invented stories claiming they had secretly married. However, historians have found no reliable evidence that Queen Victoria and John Brown were ever husband and wife. Most scholars agree that although their relationship was exceptionally close, the sensational rumors were never proven. Victoria herself rarely responded to the gossip. Instead, she continued placing her confidence in Brown. She presented him with gifts. She praised his loyalty in private writings. She defended him whenever members of the royal household criticized his behavior. This only fueled more speculation. To those outside the palace, Brown's importance seemed impossible to explain. Why would the most powerful woman in the world depend so heavily on one Scottish servant? The answer may have been surprisingly simple. John Brown never tried to replace Prince Albert. He understood that no one ever could. Instead, he accepted Victoria exactly as she was, a grieving widow carrying a sorrow that would never completely disappear. That quiet understanding created a bond few others could match. Years later, after John Brown died in 1883, Queen Victoria was devastated once again. She ordered memorials to be created in his honor. She kept photographs of him. She wrote about him with deep affection in her journals. Some members of the royal family disliked this greatly, believing Brown had been given too much importance. But Victoria refused to apologize for valuing loyalty. By now, more than 20 years had passed since Prince Albert's death. Yet the Queen still wore black every single day. She still spoke of Albert as the greatest love of her life. She still preserved his memory in every palace she visited. Britain watched as its monarch grew older, quieter, and increasingly mysterious. Many wondered whether Queen Victoria would ever truly return to the public life she had once embraced. But an unexpected event was about to change everything. The British Empire was expanding across continents, and its people wanted their queen to be seen once again. Reluctantly, the grieving widow would soon be called back into the spotlight, not because her sorrow had ended, but because history demanded it. And when she finally stepped back before the public, the world would discover that Queen Victoria had become a very different ruler from the young woman who had once fallen in love with Prince Albert. By the early 1870s, Britain had changed dramatically. The Industrial Revolution was transforming cities. Railways stretched across the country. Factories produced goods that were shipped around the world. The British Empire continued. Just when many people believed Queen Victoria would spend the rest of her life in quiet mourning, another unexpected person entered her world. His name was Abdul Karim. Unlike John Brown, Abdul Karim had traveled thousands of miles from India. In 1887, Britain celebrated Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, marking 50 years on the throne. As part of the celebrations, 2 Indian attendants were sent to England to present gifts from India. One of them was the 24-year-old Abdul Karim. No one at court imagined that this young clerk from Agra would soon become one of the most influential people in the Queen's personal life. At first, Abdul's duties were simple. He served at royal dinners. He assisted during ceremonial events. But Victoria quickly noticed something different about him. He was intelligent, respectful, and well-educated. Unlike many people who surrounded the Queen, Abdul spoke openly when she asked questions about India, its people, its languages, and its customs. Victoria had ruled over an empire that included millions of Indian subjects, yet she realized how little she truly knew about their daily lives. She wanted to learn more. Soon, Abdul Karim was promoted and given a remarkable title. The Queen called him the Munshi, meaning teacher. Every day, Abdul gave Victoria lessons in Hindustani, the language that later developed into modern Hindi and Urdu. She carefully practiced writing new words. She copied Indian phrases into notebooks. She even signed some of her private notes using words she had learned from Abdul. For an elderly queen in her late 60s, this was extraordinary. She was still eager to learn. She asked endless questions about Indian history, food, religion, festivals, and family life. The lessons soon became conversations. The conversations became friendship. Before long, Abdul Karim was traveling with the Queen to Windsor Castle, Osborne House, and Balmoral. His position at court grew stronger. That was when the problems began. Many members of the royal household disliked him from the very beginning. Some believed he had risen far above his social position. Others feared he was gaining too much influence over the Queen. Ministers complained. Royal officials protested. Even members of Victoria's own family questioned why Abdul received such special treatment. The criticism became increasingly harsh. Some newspapers portrayed him as an outsider who did not belong in the royal household. Behind closed doors, courtiers whispered that the Queen was allowing personal affection to cloud her judgment. Victoria refused to listen. Whenever someone criticized Abdul, she defended him. She rewarded him with honors. She arranged better accommodation for him and his family. She insisted that he be treated with respect. In private letters, the Queen expressed her disappointment at the prejudice she believed he faced simply because he was Indian. To Victoria, Abdul Karim was not a political advisor. He was a trusted companion who helped her understand a part of her empire she had long wanted to know better. Historians continue to debate exactly how much influence Abdul truly had. However, there is broad agreement on one point. He became one of the Queen's closest personal companions during the final years of her life. His presence also revealed another side of Victoria. The world saw a strict monarch dressed in black. But inside the palace, she remained curious, warm, and deeply interested in people she trusted, regardless of their background. Yet this friendship came at a price. The tension inside the royal household grew worse each year. Senior officials began keeping careful watch over Abdul's activities. Some even searched for evidence that he was abusing the Queen's trust. Nothing significant was ever proven. Still, suspicion never disappeared. When Queen Victoria grew older and her health began to decline, those around her wondered what would happen after her death. Would Abdul Karim remain an honored member of the royal household? Or would everything change the moment a new king took the throne? The answer came sooner than anyone expected, and it would erase almost every visible trace of one of the most unusual friendships in British royal history. By the late 1890s, Queen Victoria had become an old woman. Her hair had turned white. Her steps had become slower. Years of grief, responsibility, and age had begun to take their toll. Yet one thing had never changed. She still wore black. Nearly 40 years had passed since Prince Albert's death, but she had never stopped mourning the man she believed was her soulmate. Across Britain, people now viewed her differently. The young queen, who had once been criticized for hiding from public life, had become a symbol of stability. Generations had grown up knowing no other monarch. For many of her subjects, Queen Victoria was Britain itself. Her empire stretched across the globe. Millions of people lived under the British crown. But behind the magnificent ceremonies and military parades, the Queen remained deeply private. She often spent her evenings reading old letters from Albert. She looked through family photographs and paintings. Sometimes she asked attendants to bring her personal belongings that had once belonged to her husband. Those quiet moments meant more to her than the grandest state banquet. As her health declined, Victoria began thinking about death. Unlike many rulers before her, she carefully planned her own funeral. Her instructions surprised almost everyone. She did not want a funeral filled only with darkness. Although she had lived as a widow for 40 years, she wished to be remembered not only as a grieving queen, but also as a loving wife. She requested that several personal mementos be placed inside her coffin. Among them were keepsakes connected to Prince Albert, small reminders of the man whose memory had shaped the rest of her life. She also requested that a photograph of John Brown be placed discreetly among her personal belongings inside the coffin, where it would not be easily seen by others. It was a deeply personal decision. To the outside world, John Brown had been a servant. To Victoria, he had been a loyal friend who had stood beside her during some of the darkest years of her life. As for Abdul Karim, he remained one of the Queen's trusted companions until the very end. He continued assisting her, teaching her, and accompanying her whenever possible. Despite criticism from members of the royal household, Victoria never withdrew her confidence in him. Then came the final days. On January 22nd, 1901, at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, Queen Victoria passed away peacefully at the age of 81. She had ruled Britain for nearly 64 years, longer than any British monarch before her. News of her death spread across the empire with astonishing speed. Church bells rang. Flags were lowered. Newspapers around the world printed special editions. For millions of people, it felt as though an entire age had come to an end. Historians would later call the Victorian era a period defined by industrial progress, scientific discovery, imperial expansion, and enormous social change. Yet for those who knew Victoria personally, her death marked something even simpler, the end of a lifelong love story. When preparations for the funeral began, her carefully written instructions were followed with remarkable attention. She was dressed in a white gown beneath her ceremonial robes, a choice that reflected both dignity and peace. The treasured keepsakes she had requested were placed beside her. In death, just as in life, Prince Albert remained close to her heart. On February 2nd, 1901, Queen Victoria was laid to rest beside Prince Albert in the Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore. After almost 4 decades apart, husband and wife were finally reunited. But while one chapter of history had ended, another was about to begin. Her eldest son became King Edward VII. He respected his mother's achievements. However, he did not share her feelings toward Abdul Karim. Within days of the Queen's death, Edward ordered that much of the correspondence between Victoria and Abdul Karim be collected. Many letters were destroyed. Abdul Karim was instructed to return to India. Almost overnight, the man who had spent years at the center of the Queen's private world disappeared from the royal court. It seemed as though history itself was trying to erase him. For decades, very few people knew the full story of their friendship. Only much later, when surviving diaries and documents were rediscovered, did historians begin piecing together what had really happened behind the palace walls. Yet one mystery remained. After all these years, why does Queen Victoria's story continue to fascinate people around the world? Perhaps the answer has less to do with crowns and palaces than with something every human being understands: love, loss, and the memories we refuse to let go. More than a century has passed since Queen Victoria's death. Empires have risen and fallen. Kings and queens have come and gone. The world has changed beyond recognition. Yet one question continues to fascinate historians and millions of people around the globe. Why did Queen Victoria spend the last 40 years of her life in mourning? The answer is more complex than many people imagine. It was not simply because she was a queen. It was because she was a wife who had lost the person she trusted most. Prince Albert was never just a royal husband. He was Victoria's closest advisor, her partner in raising their 9 children, and the person who helped shape the modern British monarchy. When he died in 1861, Victoria did not simply lose a husband. She lost a person who gave her confidence, comfort, and emotional strength. Everything that followed, her black clothing, her withdrawal from public life, the preserved rooms, and her quiet existence inside the palace, grew from that single loss. Of course, over the years, many stories have been exaggerated. Some claim Queen Victoria secretly married John Brown. Others insisted that Abdul Karim controlled the Queen's decisions. These stories have appeared in books, newspapers, and films for generations. But careful historical research tells a more balanced story. There is no convincing historical evidence that Queen Victoria secretly married John Brown. Likewise, there is no reliable evidence that Abdul Karim controlled government policy or the British Empire. What historians do agree on is this: John Brown was a deeply trusted and loyal companion who helped the Queen through years of profound grief. Abdul Karim became a valued friend and language teacher during the final years of her life, offering companionship when loneliness had become a constant part of her world. The truth, in many ways, is more powerful than the myths. Queen Victoria was not hiding a secret romance. She was trying to survive heartbreak. And perhaps that is why her story still feels so human today. Despite her sorrow, Victoria continued to serve as Britain's monarch for nearly 64 years. During her reign, Britain witnessed extraordinary change. Railways connected distant cities. Telegraph wires carried messages across continents. Factories transformed industry. Medical science advanced rapidly. Photography captured moments that had once been impossible to preserve. The British Empire expanded until it became the largest empire in history. By the end of her reign, nearly a quarter of the world's population lived under British rule. Her name became so closely linked with the age that historians still call the period the Victorian era. It was an age remembered for progress, strict social values, scientific discovery, and imperial power. Yet behind that remarkable era stood a woman who carried a private sorrow every single day. Perhaps that is the greatest irony of Queen Victoria's life. She ruled the most powerful empire on earth. She commanded armies. She advised prime ministers. She influenced world history. Yet she could not conquer grief. No crown could heal a broken heart. No palace could erase loneliness. No empire could bring Prince Albert back. Today, visitors walk through royal residences where Victoria once lived. They admire grand staircases, elegant drawing rooms, glittering chandeliers, and priceless works of art. But behind those magnificent walls echoes the story of a woman who spent 4 decades honoring the memory of the man she loved. Her life reminds us that history is not only made by battles, treaties, and kings. It is also shaped by love, loss, and the deeply personal choices that powerful people make behind closed doors. Queen Victoria's 40 years of mourning changed how the public viewed the monarchy. Her devotion to Albert became one of the most famous love stories in royal history. Whether admired or criticized, her unwavering loyalty has never been forgotten. And perhaps that is why, more than 100 years later, people are still asking the same question. What really happened behind the palace doors after Prince Albert died? Now you know. It was not a story of hidden treasure or dark conspiracies. It was the story of a grieving queen who spent the rest of her life keeping the memory of her husband alive. Sometimes, the greatest mysteries in history are not about power. They are about the human heart. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into one of history's most fascinating royal stories, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments which historical figure you would like us to explore next. Until then, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next documentary. ****.